Take all that and you can give every single American, not a means test a little bit, every single one, almost $4,000 each. So I retweeted something on Twitter, and of course, you're always going to get attacked on Twitter when you are fighting for working class people and exposing the Democrats, for the shit policies that they, put forth and act like they're some major piece of progressive legislation like they've been saying and all that BS. So what I said was, on Lee Camp's show, Redacted Tonight, what I said was, there's not a single redistributive policy in the American Rescue Plan in this $1.9 trillion bill. Now, people were saying, oh, well, you have the child tax credit. And then people were saying, oh, they're literally giving people money. Yes, they are. And that's not necessarily a redistributive policy. So, I'm sure there's a lot of bad faith actors out there, but I'm sure there's also a lot of people that just don't know the difference between like something like a distributive policy and a redistributive policy. So let's look into that a little bit. This says public policy is a government plan of action to solve problems that people share collectively or that they cannot solve by themselves. Policies that address these problems can be redistributive policies, which shift resources from those who have them to those who do not, or distributive policies, which use the resources of all to benefit a segment of society. And so that's quintessentially what's within the American Rescue Plan is distributive policies. Distributive policies, like we already have on the books. Now, they're like the child tax credit is already a distributive policy that's been on the books. They expanded it. So that's not a redistributive policy. And why is that? Well, you're not taking from a certain segment of the public and giving to a larger segment of the public. You're not taking from billionaires and giving to poor and low income people. You're taking from the whole pot of tax money, taxpayer funded money, and you're giving it to those, you're targeting it or means testing it to, a small group of people in need. And it's really not a small group of people, but relative. The child tax credit goes to people making within that range, from 0 to 80,000. I think it might be 0 to 100,000. But it's like I said, it's means tested. It's just for people with kids, and it's based on your tax return and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's by the definition, that is a distributive policy, not a redistributive policy. And in fact, what we know and what we learn time after time again is that rich people actually, percentage-wise, pay less than poor or low-income people because they make a lot of their money not in wages. They make a lot of their money in stocks and investments, which they've paid off the politicians to ensure that those, the tax rates on those type of, income, that type of income is lower than, taxes that are on income that come from wages. There's been studies about that. I'll link the article that shows that actually, I think recently, as of 2019, the richest 400. Oh, here we go. Let's pull it up right here. America's richest 400 families now pay a lower tax rate than the middle class. The 400 richest U.S. families now pay a lower overall tax rate than the middle class. The first time that's happened in 100 years. This was in 2019, according to economists Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman. Factoring in federal, state, and local taxes, those ultra-wealthy households pay a total rate of about 23%. That compares with just over 24% for the bottom half of households. The U.S. now looks like the tax system of a plutocracy, Saez and Zuckman say. Well, that would make sense considering the United States is a plutocracy. I think the Princeton study that happened a few years ago showed that what majority of Americans want reflected in policies, depending on polls, does not actually get reflected in legislation. But what the richest corporations and the richest individuals in the country want reflected in policy always get reflected within policy and within legislation. So that's why you need a truly redistributive policy to actually, make this a more equitable society. Actually redistribute that wealth from those ultra wealthy families who have so much money that they could never spend all the money that they have in multiple lifetimes, while at the same time you have people living under in tents under every bridge in LA, massive amounts of homeless people in New York City. I mean, just every major city, Houston, Chicago, people that were lining up for bread lines during the pandemic, people can't pay their rent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We all know the grave situation that exists here in this country, while those people have more money than they could ever imagine to spend in multiple lifetimes. And so what are some examples, Justin? What are some examples of redistributive policy? Well, something that wasn't in the American Rescue Plan, which Bernie was, pushing for when he was, a presidential candidate, candidate for the Democratic Party in the primary. One of his policies was a wealth tax, and here it is: establish an annual tax on the extreme wealth of the top 0.1% of U.S. households. So the top, not even the top 1%, the top 0.1% of U.S. households. This is a very, very, very small group of people, very small number of people. Only apply to net worth of over $32 million, and anyone who has a net worth of less than $32 million would not see their taxes go up at all under this plan. Will raise an estimated $4.35 trillion over the next decade and cut the wealth of billionaires in half over 15 years, which would substantially break up the concentration of wealth and power of this small privileged class. And by the way, even if you half their wealth in 15 years, they'll have tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars still, which is more money than they could spend in probably 1,000 lifetimes. So they really should be taxed even more than that. Ensure that the wealthy are not able to evade the tax by implementing strong enforcement policies. Another policy was Bernie Sanders had a policy for a Wall Street tax. Obviously, we know Wall Street and the amount of stealing and thievery they do of the American people and how they get bailed out every single time because they pay the politicians to make sure that they get those bailouts. And so what Bernie Sanders wanted was a Wall Street tax. The tax on Wall Street speculation, also known as a financial transaction tax, is estimated to generate up to $2.4 trillion in public revenue from wealthy investors over 10 years. Sanders said these funds could be used to make college tuition free, reduce student debt, repair the nation's infrastructure. Literally, we could use it for whatever we want. We just need to get it away from these, massive corporations who just hoard the wealth over and over and over again. And while they're hoarding all that wealth, putting it in offshore tax havens, et cetera, buying back their own stock, then getting bailed out when they don't have a rainy day fund like regular people are expected to have. If we don't actually have some redistributive policies, this is going to continue to happen. There was nothing like that in the American Rescue Plan. So I really don't want to hear it. I really don't want to hear it that this is some amazing progressive piece of legislation, because that's BS. We all know that. And we can see facts, and we're not just going to be that easily gaslit. Now, this is an amazing stat. This is an amazing stat that I really want everyone to take in. U.S. billionaire wealth grows $1.3 trillion since mid-March 2020. So since the pandemic started, the U.S. billionaire world, just the 600-something billionaires, a small, tiny group of people, 600 people in a country of over 300 million. Their wealth grew by $1.3 trillion. Their wealth went from $3 trillion in March 18th to now it's upwards of $4.3 trillion. And at the same time, workers lost $3.7 trillion in earnings during the pandemic. Women and Gen Z saw the biggest losses. So while they're making $1 trillion, the workers are losing $3 trillion. And the billionaires' $1.3 trillion pandemic wealth gain alone could pay for over 2/3 of President Biden's proposed $1.9 trillion COVID rescue package, which congressional Republicans have attacked as too costly. So have Democrats. At $4.2 trillion, the total wealth of America's 664 billionaires is also more than two-thirds higher than the $2.4 trillion in total wealth held by the bottom half of the population, 165 million Americans. So 165 million Americans put together have just about half of what these billionaires have now. Let that sink in. The $1.3 trillion wealth gain by the U.S. billionaires since March 2020 could pay for a stimulus check of more than $3,900 for every one of the roughly 331 million people in the United States. A family of four will receive $15,000. So they alone, with the money they've made since the pandemic started, could give every American, every single one, not a means tested, we're going to leave out 17 million, we're going to tighten the restrictions and regulation, we're going to do all this and make sure it's so targeted. No. You don't have to do any of that. Make them just as wealthy, which as when the pandemic started, which is more wealth than you could spend in multiple lifetimes. Just take that. Take all that, and you can give every single American, not a means test a little bit, every single one, almost $4,000 each. That's a redistributive policy. How about we get that bill on the floor? And I want to see all those millionaire senators debate and tell American people why we shouldn't take some of the $150 billion that Elon Musk has went up in wealth, or Jeff Bezos making $80-90 billion since the pandemic started while people starve, his own workers starve, use food stamps, et cetera, et cetera. I want to see them debate that on the floor. So why don't we get some progressives to bring that as a bill? Because this shit is unbelievable. Every American, every single one, would get $4,000 if we just took it from the 600 something people that made over $1 trillion during the pandemic. And we're not even talking about hundreds of millionaires. Like, let's not forget that there's 800 millionaires, 900 millionaires, 600 millionaires, 700 millionaires who have still, those people have more money than they could ever spend. We're just talking about the billionaires. Isn't that wild? Isn't that wild? So to go back to the beginning, the difference between, what's the biggest differences between distributive and redistributive policies? Well, let's see. A distributive policy provides considerable benefits to special interests, whereas redistributive policies usually do not, which we've seen in the American Rescue Plan, where, some of these distributive policies are actually going to go to funding these health insurance companies and COBRA subsidies and whatnot. Distributive policies provide considerable benefits for a few people and relatively small costs for many, which is, where you take out of the big pool of taxpayer dollars to give considerable benefits for a few people, like people with kids, or people who make under 25K or stuff like that. Whereas redistributive policies produce considerable benefits, $4,000 for everybody, to some segments of society, but high cost to others. Really not that high of a cost to those billionaires. So I'll push back on that a little bit. Distributive policies are capitalist, whereas redistributive policies are socialist. Distributive policies are conservative in nature. Conservative in nature. In the grand scheme on the spectrum of international politics, this bill is a conservative bill. Whereas redistributive policies are liberal. And that's how you know the Overton window in this country is so messed up that we have progressives in Congress claiming this as some huge progressive win, when in reality, on the spectrum of international politics, this was a conservative solution to a massive problem in this country, which will probably lead to more Democratic losses in 2022.